Yeah, we're doing modern China right now.
Okay. Um, Great. Which time period in China? Like China's in right now, or what time period should we cover?
1800 until the present, um, which has a bunch of different. That sounds daunting, but it's only 200 years. And most of the topics we've covered so far in this series are longer than that.
Cool. Well, let's get into it. I mean, first, speaking to someone who doesn't know anything about China, what do we need to know about sort of China before the time period that we're covering that will help us make sense for or understand the time period we're about to cover?
China is a big place. And I know that's an idiotic way to start this podcast. It doesn't stop it from being true. And Chinese history is kind of daunting. Where I've read histories of China, and in a lot of cases, half of the history is before the birth of Christ. So this is a society that has been around for a very, very long time, and that's a good place to start with what China was like at the start of this modern period we're talking about, where the Chinese called themselves the Middle Kingdom, and in 1800 China had 300 million people, which by far made it one of the most populous places on the planet. It was the largest country geographically on the planet, barring Russia, the size of the current United States, where the United States was big. And so it's this giant empire that is cut off from the rest of the world. Where an interesting fact is that the Chinese weren't aware of the existence of non-Chinese civilization until around the time of the birth of Christ, and um, and so because of that, the Chinese developed this attitude that they are the most special civilization in the world and that no one can ever hurt them. And so the Chinese talk about all under heaven, which is this concept that everything important is part of China. And so when we're going to start this story in 1790, when Lord Macartney, a British ambassador, went to China, and he showed the Chinese what technology Britain had. In that the British had elementary computers, they had steam engines, they had rifles, all technology centuries more advanced than China. And the British ran India, so it was a British delegation coming out of India, just asking China to trade. And the Chinese said, "You guys have absolutely nothing we need." And and that's a great place to start because it shows these two worlds converge. A Chinese civilization that is fundamentally technologically and socially stagnant, but still massive and very arrogant, versus a Britain that had just started the Industrial Revolution and is a tiny island with the population and size of a single province in China.
Yeah. And so say more about like why didn't they have anything they needed and why is that important?
So China has suffered from the too much of a good thing paradox, where there's a certain factor in economic history where if you're if you have a lot of oil, it doesn't create an incentive for you to improve your economy because you're already making a lot of money off that. And China kind of had that issue where China occupies the same latitudes as the American East Coast. Beijing sits at Philadelphia, Shanghai sits at New Orleans, Hong Kong is Cancun, and Harbin is Quebec. And so China is this massive area that was completely self-sufficient for resources. So they actually didn't need to trade anything with the British. But the thing is, China had no military competitors, where if you look at Europe in this time period, it was constant conflict between the French, the Spanish, the Austrians, the British. And so that forced the Europeans to constantly innovate. So this was the golden age in Europe, where Europe led the world in technology, military, social, cultural, economic, whatever factors. And China was the wealthiest society in the world for a very long period before that. In the year 1800, China was the largest economy in the world by a pretty significant margin, but it was not a very advanced economy where there was no industrialization. It was the largest economy in the world due to just having so many people, but it couldn't compete on an industrial basis. And so China, because it had no military competitors, never had the impetus to advance. And so it kind of got locked into stasis, where the China of 1,000 years beforehand, there were almost no innovations, or the Chinese did invent things. The Chinese invented the compass, they invented gunpowder, they invented the printing press, but they didn't use any of that because China became such a conservative society because there was no incentive to change that the Europeans took these Chinese inventions that the Chinese themselves didn't use.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So let's proceed the story. So, what you've talked about? Sort of, we started with sort of the
Yeah.
Britain realizing they didn't have anything to trade. Where to now?
Yes. China was run by the Manchus at the time, where the Chinese, this just plays off the theme uh, of having too much of a good thing as an issue. Because the Chinese didn't have any military competitors, they lost the ability to fight. And so all of these nomadic peoples who had 1/100th the population of China conquered China. And the Mongols are one example where Genghis Khan and a relatively Genghis Khan, and this is a period long before what we're discussing. Genghis Khan is like 1200, we're at 1800. He beat Chinese armies 4 times his size as a Mongol. And the Manchus are similar, where in the previous Ming dynasty, the Ming were ethnically Chinese and they were a reaction to the Mongols. The Manchus took over the Ming dynasty in China, and the Manchus were barbarians from Manchuria, which is the the northeast of China. And the Manchus now are borderline extinct, where the ethnic Chinese have populated Manchuria. But Manchuria is an area in northeastern China the size of Texas, and they conquered China and ruled it from the 1640s until 1910. And so for 300 years, the native Chinese were conquered by this barbarian tribe from the northeast of China, and they were kept as second class citizens. And China has one of the most nationalistic histories of any country in the world, where if you read Chinese histories today, they're reflections of what are the dreams of the nationalists who write these histories now. And so there's all this waffling where Chinese historians will say, oh, the second the Manchus conquered us, they assimilated and they were automatically Chinese. But in my opinion, that's political propaganda, where even 200 years afterwards, you can see that there were legally different statuses between the Manchu ruling class and the population. And an event we're going to talk about later in this episode, the Taiping Rebellion, was a native Chinese rebellion against the Manchu conquerors.
Got it. And before progressing here, can you say more about what was sort of China's relative position in sort of global geopolitics at the time?
Yes. China was, in some metrics, the most important place in the world.
Wow.
And so this is a general theme we've seen where Europe, I would say Europe became the most advanced society in the world sometime around the Black Death, where at the Black Death in the 1300s, that's when Europe got an advantage technologically, socially, economically, whatever. And you start to see the Europeans colonize the rest of the world. But until the Industrial Revolution, or around 1800, the European advantage against other Eurasian civilizations like the Muslims, the Indians, the Chinese, it wasn't totally noticeable. And so in 1800, as I said before, the Europeans had advantages in guns, they had advantages in economics and machinery, but you could still see a Chinese and a European peasant, and they lived roughly similar lives. Chinese armies could still beat European armies from time to time. And so China was, as an example of the kind of place China was, when the Spanish conquered the New World and Mexico and Peru and that stuff, they took this gold, and the Spanish spent it on 2 things: conquering Europe and silk and spices and stuff from China. So when the Spanish took their gold from the Americas, they spent it in China because China produced the things they wanted, like ceramics or tea or silk. And So the Chinese economy actually became dependent upon the Spanish Empire. And so when the Spanish had a recession due to all the wars they were fighting in Europe, that killed the Chinese Ming dynasty. So China was a very populous, very wealthy, very powerful country, but it was one that was falling. And you could actually make the argument that China was the most important area economically in the world at this point. Um, and back in the time of the American Revolution or the Enlightenment, European thinkers wanted to be like China. The bureaucratic states that developed in Europe were based off China. The French Revolution and those ideals of we can remove the king if he's not doing his right, we think that might have come from Chinese philosophy. Voltaire and a lot of writers of the Enlightenment said Europe should be like China because China was seen as this wealthy, this stable, this peaceful society. So China was a combination of they were a very wealthy, large, peaceful society, but also they were stagnant. And so it's this duality.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Okay, so should we get to the Taipei Rebellion, or were there major events that happened before?
There's one or two steps I have to get to beforehand. So what happened with China is that they had a period of 300 years of peace. And over that period of peace, there were new advances in agricultural methods. So China's population tripled in the period between 1600 and 1800. And this was a period of wealth, but then also through this period of population growth, China became a very unequal, a very scarce Malthusian society where most people lived in complete grinding poverty. There were a few very wealthy people. And the way China was run is it's much like our current society, where they had bureaucracies, where you took a test and your results on the test determined what positions in the government you had. And so this test became intensely competitive. And the thing is, there weren't enough good jobs for people to try and take the test, which created this giant social class of millions of people who were disaffected and just had nothing to do. And because there were so many people in poverty, it created social instability. And then an important variable happened at this point, which was the Opium Wars. It's funny, I spent so much time on the internet, the first thing I hear when I think opium is copium. So I automatically think the Copium Wars, which I think would be an apt descriptor of our current times. But the Opium Wars were at 1840 now. Lord Macartney's trip to China was 1790. So in 1790, the Chinese said the British had nothing that they wanted. And then in 1840, the British had a lot they wanted to buy off China, where the British wanted tea and silk and ceramics and stuff from China, but the British didn't really have much they could offer China. And so they started selling opium to China. And again, this is a really horrible period of history. This is a lot of people were barely getting by, and so opium did very well in China. And so the Chinese, I think like 10% at least got addicted to opium. And opium just spread very rapidly around China. It became very popular, so much so the Chinese government wanted to ban the sale of opium because it was just doing damage to the society. And the British realized if the Chinese don't let us sell opium, then we can't balance this trade balance because the Chinese want stuff. We want stuff from the Chinese. We don't really have much to offer them except opium. And so this started the Opium Wars. And Karl Marx, we all know that I love Karl Marx. We those who know my channel know that I have deeply enamored with Karl Marx. But if you look at the era history he was writing, the stuff he said, a lot of it wasn't unreasonable, where Britain literally started a war so that they could sell opium to a foreign country, so to make their merchant class richer. And this is one of those things where this is one of the places where I genuinely think people who are against colonialism have a point. But the thing that made the Opium Wars so brutal, and the Opium Wars in many ways are brutal to watch because Britain is the size of Michigan. China is the size of America. Britain was fighting on the opposite side of the earth on China's turf. About 20 British ships brought the Chinese nation to its knees because Britain was so much more advanced in their weaponry and in their military style that the British just blew up the entire Chinese navy and started attacking the ports on the Chinese coast. So a handful of British ships were able to bring China to its knees. And this was the period where Europe had the biggest advantage over the rest of the world, where a couple decades later, Europe conquered all of Africa, an area 4 times Europe's size, in 10 years with losing less than 5,000 men. So this was the period where, due to the start of the Industrial Revolution, Europe had the biggest technological advantage it ever would over the rest of the world. And the Opium Wars was one of the most important points to understand about China today, because if you look at the Communist Party, the Opium Wars is something they constantly remind their population over, because it was seen as so incredibly humiliating, where China was seen as the great country, all under heaven, and Britain just brought it to its knees so quickly. And then the British forced the Chinese to buy their opium, and they also established a series of forts along the Chinese coast. And these forts later became the most important cities in China. Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a fishing village. It became a British port, a British colony. Then it became the city it is. Shanghai was a minor fishing village too. The British took it. Then it became the largest and most populous city in China. And this was deeply humiliating to the Chinese because they had such a pride as a society. So the idea that these foreign barbarians, they called the British, they called them the red-faced barbarians or the red-haired barbarians, because Brits have white people's faces turn red when they drink too much or they're angry, and they, like, British people can have red hair. It's funny to see what other peoples around the world call white people. For the Maoris, they refer to white people as pale ghosts. And we have records from ancient China calling white people the sunken-eyed ghosts. I think if you have pale skin, if you don't have pale skin, white people look like corpses. But digression aside, this was deeply humiliating to China, and so China has spent the 200 years since. And keep in mind, China's a very long historic country, so they will obsess over this stuff forever, because 200 years to them is not that long. And as I'll leave off now, the Chinese have been humiliated by the Europeans, and the Europeans have established ports along the Chinese coast where they can trade with China and which are independent jurisdictions.
And just to back up, this might be a dumb question, but Britain had to sell opium. They couldn't just buy the goods for money.
Yeah, because Britain didn't have anything China wanted. Britain was in the Industrial Revolution. It's not like Britain was a primitive society. It was more technologically advanced than China. But the thing is that anything Britain could get from China, the Chinese could get from themselves more cheaply. Where, let's say, with the Industrial Revolution, Britain could produce cloth or weapons or any of that stuff. The thing is, Chinese labor was so dirt cheap, they could just make that stuff at home.
Got it.
Or the
How about
Chinese
just
had...
money? Did money not exist in a trade kind of way, or?
Yes, they could give the Chinese money. The problem is they ended up with a negative trade balance. And that negative trade balance was something they didn't like. And they, because the British didn't like the idea of them giving away money and not getting something in return. And the British Empire was very decentrally run. And so it's not like the Opium War was a decision that came from London. The British Empire, it's like, the best way to describe it is that they subcontracted startups to different parts of the empire, and the startups ran it, with the Virginia Company being one example. The East India Company literally ran the British Empire in Asia. And ironically, the East India Company, a company, would be the second most populous country in the world because they ran India. And so the East India Company, they operated according to shareholders. And so they were the ones making this calculation where they thought, okay, we're a company. We have to make money for our shareholders. If we're losing money trading with China, that's bad for our shareholders. So we should just attack China. And then they told Britain's 4 months away, 5 months away, hey, we attacked China. Queen Victoria's like, how am I, like, what am I supposed to do about this? You guys made the choice. You guys are going to win the war.
Yeah. Okay, so what was the outcome of the Opium War?
Britain just won. It's an incredible war because, as I said before, 20 British ships knocked out the most powerful country in China, and I think the war took let me look this up. I think it took a couple weeks. It's morally, it is one of the most questionable things the English-speaking world has done, but in sheer capability, it is one of the most impressive things we've done. It was 3 years. Oh, it was 2 years. Okay, that's longer than I thought.
Okay, so the outcome is that China has this sort of is internationally humiliated and builds
Yes.
this sort of narrative that we need to return to greatness, or kind of
Yes.
what progressed this way from there.
Which leads to the next event, which is the Taiping Rebellion, where with great empires like the Romans we spoke of before or the Spanish, the myth of empire is one of the strongest things about an empire. The idea that the empire is invincible is the actual idea which holds empire together. Because in most cases, if you actually test that invisibility, you'll find it's a lot weaker than people think. Look at the American dollar today, where if everyone pulled out their loyalty to the American dollar, it would fall apart. But the idea that the American dollar is so strong is what keeps the dollar going. And the British just destroying China, destroying the Chinese Navy, destroyed the myth inside China that the Chinese were invincible. And this had profound ramifications for the native Chinese population. Where I said before, China was run by the Manchu barbarian ruling class in Beijing, and 95% of the empire's population were the ethnic Han Chinese. And so the indigenous population of China saw, wait, our government is this weak against the Europeans, why don't we rebel? Enter Hong Shukan, who was a failed, as I said before, you had this entire subclass. The only way to get wealthy in China was to take the government exam and then get a good government job and then predate from the population through corruption. China was not a capitalist society, or it was a weakly capitalist society. So the road to wealth was through the government, but then there weren't enough government jobs, which created this giant class of dissatisfied people who had no road up through social mobility. And Hong Shuquan was one of them. He was a Hakka, which is an ethnic minority in China, from the southern province of Guangzhou, of Guangdong, around modern Hong Kong. And he failed the exam multiple times. And then, from the shame of failing the exam, he started having seizures. And in those seizures, he saw that he was the second son of Christ. He was the younger brother of Christ, and that he was brought by God to liberate the Chinese people. And so he heard of Christianity due to a missionary from Kentucky who was spreading Christianity in China. And this is a side tangent where American missionaries actually had a very profound effect on China over this time period. The American missionaries banned foot binding, which was a custom in China where you would break women's feet to be half the length to make them more attractive. The American missionaries pushed to ban that. And as we'll get later, the capitalist nationalist faction in China was based off this American influence. And they also introduced the idea of democracy into China. But Hong Shuquan then launched a revolution saying he was the second son of Christ. And this form of Christianity is the Taipings, where their goal was to form a communist utopia based off the teachings of Christ. But it's nothing that, if you were a Christian in another part of the world, the Taipings are completely unrecognizable to you. It's comparable to the Nation of Islam, which is an African American breakaway of Islam. but it bears very little resemblance to what Islam is in Saudi Arabia or Indonesia or stuff. And so the Taipings launched this revolution, which, long story short, killed 30 million people. It's the third bloodiest war in history and was fought at the time of the American Civil War. But then the imperial government gradually crushed the Taipings, and their leader went crazy. And so China, I'm simplifying a lot here, China had the third bloodiest war in history, which almost no one has heard of.
And why haven't people heard of it? It just hasn't made.
No one pays attention to Chinese history. I mean, the average
Right.
person knows nothing about history, and so
Right.
expecting them to know about a different continent is
Yeah.
difficult. And also, it just doesn't fit into easy narratives where the American Revolution fits into a very easy narrative about what America is today. Having this bizarre Christian communist cult kill 30 million people is not it's not an easy narrative to explain to the world. And it's funny, I know a lot of Chinese people. Talking to Chinese people, lots of them have never or barely know what the Taiping Rebellion because it's not a politically palatable topic. It's not something that the Communist Party can write histories about and say the Taipings were the good guys or the bad guys.
Right. And so, what were the biggest outcomes or ramifications from this conflict? Let's progress the story.
Yes. So the empire won, and the Manchu monarchy beat the Taipings, largely since the Taipings were so bloodthirsty and crazy. And there's a bunch of crazy stories of the Taiping Rebellion that I'm not going to get into, but I'd recommend reading the book Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom by Stephen Platt. And the result of the Taiping Rebellion was to basically let off pressure, where it killed off everyone who wanted to have a revolution, and it lessened China's population. And that brought China 60 years of stability, where there weren't any major wars, but the defeat of the Taiping Rebellion was also profoundly conservative, and so it meant there weren't the social changes and revolutions necessary for China. And because of that, China wasn't able to deal with the West. And the Russians, China got dismembered by European powers, where there was a centralized government that was not technologically advanced. In the period we're getting into of the late 19th century, this was the apex of European colonialism, when almost all of the world became a European colony. And China wasn't colonized because it was such a politically advanced society. China was a centralized country. It had a literate population. It wasn't worthwhile for the Europeans to colonize China because it's just difficult to govern. What the Europeans were incentivized to do is to basically subdivide China into different geographic regions where they could control the trade there. And so over the late 19th century, the Russians took northern China, modern Siberia, and this is a big sticking point for modern Chinese nationalists, where Russia and China are allies today. But Chinese nationalists hate that they lost Mongolia and parts of Siberia to the Russians. The British claimed the European powers split China into different zones of influence, with the Europeans taking the Yangtze and parts of the South China, the French taking the areas Vietnam, the Germans taking Shandong in north central China, the Russians taking the area around northern Manchuria and that sort of area. And this has been a mass humiliation for the Chinese nation, where they remember this point. Again, China is a proud country over its history, as China's lowest point in its history.
Yeah. Wow. And so, at what point does China start to bounce back, or what is sort of how does China go from being subdivided by sort of European colonial powers to?
That's a difficult question to answer, because China never fought off the enemies. China China had a couple of lucky historical breaks, and this process continues into World War II, where the last invader of China was the Japanese. And the reason communism eventually became so powerful in China is that the communists were seen as a reaction against these external threats.
Which external threats? The
Oh,
colonial
the
powers? Or?
Europeans, the Japanese, the Russians. And
Yeah.
around the turn of the 20th century, the Russians and the Japanese were fighting over northern China, where Manchuria is not part of traditional China. It was brought into the Chinese Empire because the Manchus conquered China. And Manchuria sits at an axis between Japan, China, and Russia. And the Japanese were the only country in Asia that were capable of industrializing. And the Japanese took Korea and they wanted to build an empire. So the Japanese and the Russians fought each other. And in a victory no one predicted, the Japanese beat the Russians and took over northeastern China. And this set up Japan to be the number one threat against China. And the European powers actually allied against Japan because it became apparent that Japan was the number one rival in that area. And the Japanese viewed the Chinese as subhuman and wanted to conquer them. And the Japanese built this whole myth around them being the co-Asia prosperity sphere, which, according to propaganda, was we're going to conquer Asia and liberate Asia from colonial empires. Keep in mind, at this time period, all of Southeast Asia except Thailand was a European colony. The reality is that this was all a facade for the Japanese to exploit the area.
Let me just return back to something that you said. You mentioned communism served as a way to fight back these existential threats. What was sort of the alternative at the time, and how did it serve as a way to fight back?
The first attempt to fight off the Europeans was the Boxer Rebellion, which, and this is still under the Manchu monarchy at the end of the 19th century. Fanatical Chinese nationalists believed that if they did certain magical rituals, the Europeans' guns couldn't kill them. That was not true. And so the monarchy tried to fight off the Europeans, and then an alliance of a bunch of European countries and America, so the Germans, the French, the British, Americans, they teamed up to crush the Boxer Revolt. What happened after this is that China fell, the Chinese monarchy fell because it had taken so much hitting by the Europeans, and also we're in the 20th century now. The age of monarchy was difficult. It's hard to be a monarchy in the 20th century. You have to be a country like Saudi Arabia, or you have to be Britain where the monarch has no power. And so China became a republic. And it was only technically a republic for a couple years under the guy who launched the revolution, Sun Yat-sen. And then it devolved into warlordism. And so early 20th century China was this amalgamation of all these warlords fighting each other. And the main leader was Chiang Kai-shek, who was a nationalist. And the nationalists were allied with the Russians and the Americans, but the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek was a Methodist. They were the American-backed faction, and then the communists were the Russian Soviet-backed faction. And so China was stuck in this civil war between the capitalist nationalists, who were still they weren't a democracy. They were a dictatorship, and the communists. And one of my personal beliefs is that Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, has been written up incorrectly in history, where I think he's more competent and intelligent than most people believe. And the communists under Mao is one of the greatest mass murderers in history. He killed 40, he is tied for greatest mass murderer ever. He killed 40 million people. And so you had this civil war at the same time as World War II. And the Japanese tried to conquer China. They conquered the eastern third of China. Well, at the same time, the communists and the nationalists were fighting each other.
And the communists win?
Yeah, the communists won. Um, it was close where there were loads of points where the nationalists could have beat the Chinese, and one point where they cornered Mao's army. An interesting point, actually, is that the Communist Party captured they captured Mao. Sorry, the Communist Party. It's complicated. The nationalists had cornered the communists in a valley. Then the communists captured the nationalist leader, and then they let the nationalist leader go upon the promise that he would fight the Japanese. And so
And
the nationalists
is
at
that
that point got close to defeating the communists, but then they fought the Japanese in the east. And the Chinese never beat the Japanese militarily, but the Americans nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki and forced the Japanese to pull out. And the and then the Russians conquered northern China. They gave northern China to the communists. The communists then beat the nationalists. So it was a very close war. The nationalists were winning, and then due to aid from the Soviets, the communists won.
interesting? And was the
Yeah.
was the crux of the war about the form of government, or was it about something else, or what was?
Yeah, the crux of the war was whether China would be capitalist or communist. And I personally believe that if China went capitalist at that point, they'd be the wealthiest country in the world today. You look at Taiwan, you look at Japan, you look at South Korea, um, and the communists won partly because they were the most fanatical. The communists could expect their men to fight the hardest of anyone. And partly due to aid from the Russians. And China became a communist country while the nationalists fled to Taiwan. And Mao is legitimately one of the craziest people in history. It's just remarkable to see where Mao wanted to have a nuclear war because he thought if there was a nuclear war, more Chinese would survive, and the few Chinese who survive would bring up the communist utopia. And Mao did all this crazy stuff, like he tried to revolutionize agriculture, but the new methods to revolutionize agriculture he used just didn't work, and so 40 million people died. Um,
Wow.
or he got people to um, or he got his goal was to increase iron production, so he made everyone in the country work all day to make iron, but the iron they made didn't work, and so they didn't farm, and so they had all this useless iron, and then everyone was starving. Imagine you're drunk playing a video game and you make all these crazy decisions to see what happens, and you don't care that like half your country's population has died. Mao was drunk video game playing his entire civilization. um, and he also just killed all the intellectuals with the Cultural Revolution, where he he got all these students, and he got the high school students and the college students to kill their teachers because the teachers had all of these negative ideas from the past that were bad, and so he just killed off China's entire intellectual class. He killed off all their artists. So Mao was worse than Stalin. When Stalin, who again is a nice guy, Stalin, when he saw Mao, he thought Mao was completely crazy and unfit for power. Let that sink in. Stalin thought Mao was crazy.
That's pretty nuts. And so how does Mao get taken down?
He just dies. Mao, there is no justice in this world because Mao died peacefully. Um, And so Mao dies in 1976, which I think surprises a lot of people because for both of us, our parents lived on, I don't know when your parents were born, but your parents spent at least 15 years on this earth at the same time as Mao. And it
Yeah.
boggles the mind. This guy died after the Beatles. This guy died when AC/DC was a popular band. He
Oh,
died right at the same time as Star Wars got popular. Um, so
so it's
Mao
pretty recent.
dies. Yeah, yeah. And China made the best choice it possibly could have done. Actually, it might not have, but let me get to that. Deng Xiaoping, Mao's successor, in the communist parties have very weird successions because there's no communist parties are based upon the lie that you can have a dictatorship of the proletariat, or that a ruler can perfectly represent what the people wants. And that's not true. But what that does is it establishes no rules of succession, where if you're a monarchy, the son just the oldest son just takes the throne. But every time a communist leader dies, there's this squabble between the factions about who should lead and afterwards. And Deng Xiaoping, thank God, seized power. And Deng Xiaoping turned China into a capitalist country. And I said that this was the best thing China could do, but also not, because if Deng Xiaoping wasn't so smart, the communists would have lost power of China, and China would have it would have gone non-communist, like Poland or Hungary or Russia or all those former all those former Soviet countries, and then China experienced. China is an example for why you don't need to have democracy to be a wealthy society, where China saw the most rapid economic growth ever from 1976 until the present. In 1976, China had an economy smaller than Spain's. And keep in mind, this was Spain before it joined the European Union and industrialized. Though Spain wasn't wealthy either. And then after that, by some metrics, China is a larger economy than America today. And China went through this policy of integrating Western trade, where they would take our manufacturing from America and then make it in China for so much cheaper. And it's really remarkable to see statistics about China, where China has used, in the 10-year period from 2010 until 2020, China used more concrete than all of American history combined. Every year for 20 years straight, China used more concrete than the entire city of Rome's entire history. So China grew very, very rapidly. And I remember I was in Shanghai, and we were looking across the Huangpo River, where I'll put a photo of this for the episode on YouTube. Our tour guide said everything you see has been built since 1990. And that's so insane, because you're looking out at these giant skyscrapers, you're looking out at these at just an infinite skyline of giant buildings that go on forever. It was all built in the last 30 years. And that's remarkable, but I think it's a double-sided coin, where if you watch my videos, and we're running out of time, I say that China is about to experience a just social collapse. And so in my opinion, at least, China went through one of the most rapid growths in history to later experience one of the most rapid crashes.
And the TLDR, we'll link to your videos and yeah, we should go deeper. But what's the TLDR as to why the crash? The birth rate stuff, or the demographic stuff, or other?
So the reason China grew so fast is the same reason why it will crash so fast. And the biggest answer is the birth rates, where the Chinese birth rate today is at a quarter of what it should be. And you just can't survive as that a society. And America's got a lot of issues. I won't deny that. But China has more issues. Their environment is polluted. They're running out of water. They have insane regulations, like you're not allowed to move outside of your hometown. I'm from Pennsylvania. Eric is from New Jersey. Eric lives in California. I live in Texas. That would be illegal in California. I wouldn't be allowed to leave Philadelphia. Sorry, illegal, not California. Yeah. Same thing. I would not be allowed to leave my hometown in China legally. And they have mass corruption. Youth unemployment in China now is at 50%. Their housing market is the craziest in the world. China is just plagued by a litany of social issues, where I think the only rational endpoint is that they will have a social crash now.
Fascinating. And so, kind of gearing towards closing, summarizing here, is it fair to say that China was sort of a fragmented sort of tool of other players like Russia and Europe, colonial powers, until World War II and Japan, at which point the other countries, just because they lost World War II, kind of enabled China to unify? Or
yes, I'm going to be an asshole here, and I'll say that China deserved it because they did nothing for 1,000 years. If your society doesn't advance all for 1,000 years and you have a century of humiliation, I don't know, maybe you should have used gunpowder. But yeah, that's accurate. Where China it's partly a process of it's partly a process of the Chinese society was in a bad place, and when they were in that bad place, the Europeans could take advantage of them. Um, and then once the age of colonialism, I think it had more to do with the age. You're right, where it had more to do with the age of colonialism ending, where once Europe after World War II stopped doing foreign policy stuff, Europe stopped colonizing places. And so after that, China was able to unify under the communists. And that set up China for what it is today.
Right. And so how does understanding sort of the time period that we've covered help us understand China today? Is one way it helps us understand by focusing on sort of, or it lets us understand why the idea of a greater China is so important, because they worry that if they're not, flourishing together, not flourishing economically, they'll become a tool of colonial powers again or become humiliated again.
You could make the argument China is the most important player in the world today. And this history is very recent. We were talking about the fall of Rome a couple weeks ago, and the fall of Rome is fun, but it's really long ago. But this history is happening in living memory, and it forms all the decisions China is making. And for people in the audience, a war with China could kill you. America could have a war with China. The fall of China's economy could be a world crisis. And so the thing that got me into personally studying geopolitics is I was obsessed with China in high school. Because when I was in high school, I saw China as America's potential rival. And I thought, as Americans, it's our duty to understand China so that they don't beat us. And so only by knowing China will we handle the world that we're living through today. Yeah. Yeah, the thing that got me interested in geopolitics was China, because growing up, I saw China as the country that could replace America. And so I wanted to study this country because it's important to know America and China are rivals now, and it's important to know how your rival works so that you can survive.
Yeah, totally. Is there anything in this episode we haven't covered, or anything top of mind that you want to close us with, or for people to go deeper?
I'm shocked I did this all in 1 hour. I was looking at this before we started, and I thought, how am I going to cover this in an hour? And the reason is I gave the Taiping Rebellion 2 minutes. But the top 3 books on this topic, the best history of China is John Key's History of China. Then, if you want to understand Chinese society, Amaury de Riencourt's The Soul of China is very good. That's more on a cultural basis than the actual topic. My favorite history of Mao is Yung Chong's History of Mao. And she's known for being very anti-Mao, which that's something to be aware of. But that I really loved reading that book. And for the final one, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom at the Taiping Rebellion is one of the best written history books I've ever read. So, summary, Mao by Yung Chong, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom by Platt, The Soul of China by Amaury de Riencourt, and China by John Key.
Yeah. And it is fascinating to think that is it the difference between Mao and Deng that explains sort of the divergence of where China was and where it went, i.e. if Mao lasted 20 more years, or we had a replacement who was, similarly minded as Mao, China could be pretty backwards.
Yeah.
Country.
I mean, what I've said before is that communism is the best thing that ever happened to America, because Russia and China, they're populous, wealthy, intelligent countries. And if Russia and China played their cards right, America wouldn't be the superpower. But if Chiang Kai-shek won rather than Mao, China would be the largest economy in the world.
Right.
They would be, because China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan are all very wealthy countries, and they're culturally and geographically very close to China. The one difference is capitalism versus communism. So as Americans, I think we should be grateful that Mao won. I feel sorry for all the Chinese who had to live through that, but from my purely selfish perspective.
Well, on that America fuck yeah note, let's wrap on that, and Always a pleasure. Until next time.
You too. Bye. Catch you later.